to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9, where we are this morning, we've been looking at all the way through Acts now from chapters 1 to 8. And we've seen Christ ascending into heaven. We've seen the marching orders he gave his disciples. He said, "You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth." And we understand from what we've been studying so far that this is going to include Gentiles also. And we looked at how they came to, Philip went down to Samaria, had a great meeting there, and thousands of people got saved, and then we saw him go out. And so that would have been the Samaritans becoming believers, and that would have been a half Jew, half Gentile. So we've gone from Jews to half Jews, half Gentiles to Gentiles. Last week we looked at the Ethiopian eunuch, who was the first Gentile believer. Now, Luke is taking a pause here in his exposition of the gospel and how it has spread throughout it is spreading throughout the world. And we're going to talk this morning about the conversion of Saul. Now, up until this point, it's been all about Peter and John, Peter and the apostles. Now we're taking a bit of a break here and looking at Saul for the next few weeks. Then in verse 32 of chapter 9, we'll go back to Peter for a bit. Okay? So let's look at chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 1 to 9 this morning. And as we look at this, we're going to look at what happens to Saul. Saul goes through a transformation that kind of goes in stages. We're going to look at 3 of those stages. But what really impressed me from this passage was the sovereignty of God. You know, when we want to persuade someone, depending on how difficult it's going to be or how important it's going to be, we will prepare and use all kind of good, cogent arguments. If it's a person in authority over us, we're going to wait until they're in a good mood at just the right time and then approach them and hope for the best. God doesn't do that. When God wants something done, he just does it. And he does it with power, he does it with might, as we're going to see here. So we're going to see this first stage here with the apostle, or with Saul, with Saul's murderous intention in verses 1 and 2. But before we do that, I want to look at his resume. Turn with me to chapter 22 of Acts, verse 3. Chapter 22, verse 3. And what we read here, Paul's giving his pedigree here. He says, "I'm a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia and brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today." Now, we remember Gamaliel from back a few chapters. He was the leading rabbi. He was like the Billy Graham of Judea. Okay, he was the best, the smartest, the most learned, the most gifted rabbi. So Paul had learning from him. In Galatians 1:14, it says that I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries of my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my father. So he was a very apt student. This treats his aptitude. He was a brilliant student. He was above the curve. He was going far beyond his contemporaries, and he was a man of zeal. He had learning, he had aptitude, and he had zeal. So this is Saul going into this thing as we look at his resume before we get on to the passage here. And actually, what we have here this morning, the conversion of Saul, it appears 3 times in the book of Acts. It appears now, it appears later on when he comes before the crowd of Jews in the temple courtyard, and comes again before the king as he gives his testimony. So we're going to be looking at all 3 of them in a bit, so we get the full story here. But let's look at his rage in verse 1. It says in verse 1, "Then Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest." Now this is an idiomatic expression, and every language has idiomatic expressions, but to be breathing threats, it says breathing threats and murder. That's to say that, have you ever heard somebody say, he eats, sleeps, and drinks this particular sport? Somebody's really enthusiastic about hockey, that's all they think about. They talk about it, they think about it, they dream about it, And it's kind of like that. You could say he breathed hockey. And that's what we're saying here. Paul was so enraged and hated the Christian movement so much that it was that he breathed it out. He breathed out threats. He breathed out murders. It consumed him. It completely consumed him. In fact, let's look at chapter 26. Turn back to the back of the book of Acts, chapter 26. We'll get some qualification here. It says in 26:11, and I punished them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged. So this touches on his rage, being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. What could possess someone to be so exceedingly enraged if it wasn't satanically inspired, trying to get this guy energized? And he would to foreign cities. He wasn't content to go just to Jerusalem and to persecute them there. He was going even to foreign cities, way out of his way. So we see here in verse 1 that he went to the high priest. Now, the high priest had a lot of sway over all the Roman provinces because they held him in high esteem and they had to keep the Jews under control. So pretty much he could do anything he wanted. And he was able to write these letters that we see here in verse 2. We see his request here in verse 2. He said, and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, he would have given him, he was asking for letters of introduction, letters of cooperation. And why go to Damascus? We don't really know. It's way out of his way. It's like 208 kilometers northeast of Jerusalem. He's going all the way there. Damascus has between 10 and 18,000 Jews, probably 30 to 40 synagogues. So he's going there with letters to get permission and cooperation from the leaders of these synagogues. Now, a couple of things about this. Let's look at chapter 28. Go back in the back of Acts to chapter 28, verse 21. Chapter 28, verse 21. It says here, then they said to him, we neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any brethren come who reported or spoken any evil against you. So they would understand this is a common thing to send letters of extradition. Help us out here. Give up these people. And they were still in the synagogues back in those days. In James chapter 2, verse 2, James writes this, for if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes. The word here for assembly is the same word for synagogues, because at this time the Christians were still meeting in synagogues. The break had not yet come. So the letters to Damascus, to the synagogues there, that's what Paul needed. He got that from the high priest. He was going there expecting the full cooperation of all the leaders and all the synagogues to give up believers so that he could bring them back. So he's asking for these letters, and he says here in verse 2 that if any who were found who were of the way. And of course, the way here is another way of saying Christianity. In fact, Jesus said, and Michelle read that in our scripture reading this morning, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So with common knowledge, everybody would understand, if you're talking about the way, they're talking about Christ. They're talking about Christ and his followers. So because of that, that's why he's using the term the way. So he's asking letters and he's talking about the way, and he wants people to be pointed out to him from the synagogue so that he can arrest them and bring them back to Jerusalem. And Paul would cast his vote in favor of execution in some cases, but he tried to get them to blaspheme so that they would be to deny Christ. And you think about this terrible kind of persecution, and we're praying for persecuted believers around the world. What kind of encouragement do we have when it comes to persecution? And I'm going to give you a couple of things here. Number one, we have the promise of reward. That should encourage us when we have persecution. Christ said in Matthew 5:12, talking about those who were persecuted for his name and for his sake, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So if you're being persecuted for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel, you have the promise of great reward. This is kind of the situation with my grandson Gabriel. He's in Sec 3 at Burling Academy, and he's being ridiculed all the time for being a believer. And they weren't satisfied with just ridiculing his beliefs and the fact that he was a believer. They got the bright idea to Google him. So they Googled him and came up with all of these YouTube videos that Wanda and Jared made as part of their deputation to raise support to go to the mission field. Some of the videos are him of a little kid, and they make fun of him because he looks like a little baby. And one of the things that they picked up on, in one of the videos, he was at a missions conference, and the video was for the missions conference, and in the video, he's asking people to pray for his classmates. So this infuriated them. And they're telling him, we don't need your prayers. I don't want you praying for me. So this is the kind of this is the kind of persecution that we can expect. And so we have the encouragement here that great is our reward in heaven. So that's one encouragement. Another encouragement is the promise of glory. 1 Peter 4:14, if you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. So that's the second encouragement that we can have. A third is the white robe. You may not be impressed with getting a white robe. You may have white robes hanging up in your closet, but this whole different idea here in Revelation 6:11. That a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. This is that portion in Revelation where the cry comes up from under the altar. In how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on those who have killed us? And this is the answer. And this white robe here is highly significant because it represents the righteous acts of the saints. It's kind of like a proof that you have led a righteous, holy, and faithful life before the Lord. And that's what this white robe signifies. So this is what we have here as far as encouragement for Paul, for Saul, his murderous intention. We looked at his resume, his rage, and his request. Saul had a plan. Saul had a plan, but Jesus had another plan. Let's look at Saul's. We move from his murderous intentions to his unexpected apprehension. I want to look first here in verse 3 and 4 at the manner of his arrest. It says in 3 and 4, as they journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now the reason why we see Saul, Saul, the name repeated twice, God did this often, and Christ did it in this particular case. When you say somebody's name twice, you really want to get their attention. That's a signal to them that what's about to follow is extremely important. Jesus did that with Martha. Remember Mary and Martha? Jesus came to visit them, and Mary's sitting at his feet, listening intently to everything he has to say, and Martha's bustling about, getting this ready, getting that ready. She gets kind of fed up. She comes to Jesus and she says, why don't you tell my sister to give me a hand here? Jesus says, Martha, Martha, I got your attention. You're anxious and worried, preoccupied with many things. Mary has chosen that which is good, and it won't be taken from her. He also did this with Simon Peter when he was predicting that Simon would betray him or deny him. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to have you so he could sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And when you return, encourage the brethren. So again, very important messages in both cases. Simon, Simon, Martha, Martha, Saul, Saul. So we have here the manner of his arrest. It starts, number one, with a light. In verse 3, we read this. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone about him from heaven. Now, let's identify this light. Go back to Acts 22, verse 14. Paul this is one of the two times that Paul is giving his defense and what happened to him. He's before the Jerusalem mob here. And he says in verse 14, talking about Ananias, who we're going to meet next week, he says, the God of our father has chosen you, that you should know his word and see the just one and hear the voice of his mouth. So it's not just a light that Paul sees, he actually sees the risen Lord, and we get this from this verse in Acts 22. So he sees the light, he hears the voice, and he gets the question, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In Matthew 25:40, it says, the king will answer and say to them, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. And so this is why Jesus asked the question, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. Saul can't touch him. But in touching his children, he's touching Christ himself. That's how closely connected we are to the Lord. That when someone strikes out at us, they're striking out at the Lord also. Okay, let's move on here. So he gets this question, why are you persecuting me? And then this leads to a response from Saul. The response to his arrest, number one, is confusion. He says in verse 5, Lord, who are you? And then the Lord said to him, I'm Jesus who you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he says he hears the voice, he sees the form, he's never seen Jesus, so he doesn't recognize him. So he's confused and he asks the question, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Goads were used for oxen. You know, oxen, they're very powerful, they're very strong, and they can pull a lot of stuff, but they can't get, it's not like they can jump. They're not like horses that can jump. They can only lift their legs up so far and just plod ahead of each other. So if you want to keep an oxen from going anywhere, you just stick these goads in a circle around him, you hammer them into the ground, and you put them in an angle about like that. And they're kind of pointed on the end, so that if an ox tries to kick against them, it not only hurts his feet, but it drives it further into the ground, so he's wasting his time. And so this is why Jesus says, it is hard for you to kick against these goats. So this is Saul's response, is confusion. Verse 6, we read this. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So his response here, confusion, trembling, astonishment, and finally submission. What do you want me to do? I'll do anything. It's implied. You got my attention now. You know, I've seen the light. I've seen who you are. I'm not myself anymore. I'll do anything that you want me to do. So let's look at the reason for his arrest here. We saw that in verse 5, that it was to reveal Christ. He said back in 5, who are you? I am the Lord. I am Jesus. So what does Paul see here? He sees the Lord that he assumed was dead. He didn't believe that Jesus was alive. He thought that Jesus was a false Messiah. He thought that all the apostles were liars and saying that he had been risen from the dead. And now he sees proof here that he is. It also reveals the futility of what his actions are. You're going to do this thing going down to Damascus. You think you're going to bring back a whole bunch of prisoners. You're wasting your time. This is futility for you. And that's the thing that encourages me. People plan things against us, but it's futile. It's futile in the Lord's program because of his sovereignty. And we think about examples of futility. You know, the plans of men versus the sovereignty of God, God's going to win every single time. Let's look at some other examples of futility. In Exodus 14:28, we had the Egyptian army. Remember what happened to them? They're chasing the children of Israel. They come down to the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea. They go across, and we read here. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. That's pretty futile, don't you think? Let them alone. Let them go. Don't chase after them. You're not going to make it. And they charged down in there. The waters collapsed over them and killed them all. So that was one example. Another example of futility would be the Sodomites. In Genesis 19:11, remember the two angels went down to Sodom to get Lot out of there, and they come to visit Lot. They come to Lot's house. All the Sodomites, all the homosexuals came around and said, pass them out to us. We want to have fun with them. And this is what happens, verse 11. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. They had a plan. God struck them blind. Another one was Herod, when he arrested and killed James, the apostle. Acts 12:7, now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and his light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, arise quickly, and his chains fell off his hands. Futility. Herod arrests James, has him put to death. Everybody likes that. Hey, that's pretty good. Let me have a double hitter here. I'm going to arrest Peter too, but no. God says, no. I don't care what your plan is. I'm overriding that plan. And he delivers Peter. So we have the reason for Saul's arrest, to reveal Christ, to reveal the futility of his actions, and to reveal his commission here, verse 6. He says in verse 6, arise and go to the city, and you will be told what you must do. So Saul had planned murder, but Jesus planned salvation. And this brings us to the last phase of Saul's discovery, Saul's humble capitulation in verses 7 to 9. Look at the effect on his companions in verse 7. It says, and the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. This kind of takes us right back to Daniel chapter 10, verse 7, when the huge, glorious, amazing angel stands before Daniel, and he has no strength. He kind of flops down. All the guys who were with him react the same way as Paul's companions. They run and they hide. They're so tore up. Now let's go to chapter 26. Again, Acts 26, verse 14. Again, we're getting back to Paul's account of his persecution. Of his conversion. And he says in verse 14, and when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me, a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the ghost. So this tells us, going back to Acts chapter 9, why are these guys standing? Well, they're standing because first they fell. Paul said that we all were knocked to the ground. And these guys just happened to get up first. So they all fall to the ground. And then they rise from the ground in verse 7. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. They couldn't see the form of Christ. They heard the noise. They didn't understand the words, but they could hear the thundering of the voice. And they knew it was something supernatural. So they fall to the ground, they rise up, they're speechless, they can't see, they can't hear anything after that. They're not blind, but they can't see who spoke. So that was the effect of his companions. Let's look at the effect on Paul. Verse 8 says, then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one, but they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. So he rises from the ground, but he can see no one. And we see down in the next verse, for 3 days he was without sight. So when Christ appeared to him in this flash of light, it blinds him. He's knocked to the ground. He can hear the voice. He can communicate with the voice, but when the voice leaves and the light leaves, he's still blind. Now this is a perfect example of the sovereignty of God in salvation. Paul was not on the way to a Christian conference. He had no idea of investigating the claims of Christ. No interest whatsoever. You couldn't be more totally hostile to the gospel than Paul was. But God overcame that. We're chosen for the foundation of the earth, Ephesians 1:4 tells us. And when God brings that, I don't know if you know anything about Calvinism. We talked a bit about it on Wednesday nights, and we'll talk about it a little more this next Wednesday night. But there's 5 points of Calvinism, and the acrostic spells out the word tulip. The first is total depravity, which means that every part of every man is touched by sin. And because of that, we're unable to make a rational choice of our own for Christ. The second letter is U, which is unconditional election. God chooses us before the foundation of the earth and doesn't give us any conditions by which he does that. The L stands for limited atonement, which I disagree with. I believe that the atonement has unlimited possibilities. The I stands for irresistible grace. I'll give you the last one, then I'll come back to the I. The last one is P for perseverance. Now, I know that my salvation will persevere to the end, but that's not what the Calvinists mean. The Calvinists mean that if you don't, that all believers will persevere to the end. And if you don't persevere in the faith, if you fall away at some point, it proves you were never a believer to start with. So I don't accept that one. But I do kind of accept irresistible grace. And this is what we see here. Irresistible grace. Boom! Christ appears to Paul, knocks him off his mount, gets his attention, and saves him. I mean, what could be a better example than that of God's irresistible grace and God's perfect and total sovereignty in this regard? So he rises from the ground. He doesn't see anybody in verses 8 and 9, which is kind of neat because we've seen God use blindness before. We saw it with the Sodomites. In Genesis 19:11, he struck them blind. We also see it with the Syrians. In 2 Kings 10:6-18. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elijah. They were coming down to arrest Elijah and haul him off and do who knows what. But God struck them with blindness. So God would use this sometimes to do what he wants to do. But then the opposite is also true in verse 17. Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. See, this was Elisha's servant. So Elisha's servant gets up in the morning. He goes out to get water, come in and make coffee or whatever. And he sees the army of the Syrians, and they're surrounding the place where they were. The city was Dothan. They're everywhere. They're all over the place. And he scares them to death. So Elijah does two things. He says, open his eyes. So the Lord opened his eyes, and I see something different now. The hills surrounding those who were surrounding Dothan were filled with chariots of the Lord. Nothing to worry about. It's in the bag. So then he strikes them with blindness. It's interesting how God uses blind. Corrie ten Boom was a Holocaust survivor. And she tells the story. She's going to be home to be with the Lord. She's a believer. But when she was taken to the first concentration camp, she had a Bible, a little small pocket New Testament with her. And, of course, that was forbidden. And she's going through the line there, and the Nazis are taking them one at a time and frisking them and checking, searching them to make sure they don't have any contraband. And she's standing there with this Bible in her pocket. They're sure to find the Bible. So she prays, Lord, strike these guys blind. And so one goes ahead of her, is checked out, released. Another goes ahead of her, checked out, released. She's next. The guy ignores her and motions to the guy behind her to come forward. So didn't even see her. Didn't even see her. So God uses this. God can strike people blind. It's kind of cool. So this is the effect on Paul. He rises from the ground. He sees no one. Paul, the raging bull, who comes down to arrest believers, is led like a little child, like a little lamb, blind into Damascus. And we know that he is saved here. We know that he is saved here. And we're going to look at that in a minute. But this is the way it's going to be. In Zechariah 12:10, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me whom they pierced, yes, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. This is God's irresistible grace. He's going to do it again. He did it here with Saul. He's going to do it again with the nation of Israel. So we know that he gets commissioned also here. So turn to chapter 26. And this is where we're going to close. This